Damien Knight, a man of immense wealth and power, finds himself struggling with the emptiness of his privileged life as he faces an ultimatum: marry and produce heirs before his 35th birthday or lose his inheritance. As the pressure mounts, a chance encounter with Mia, a seemingly ordinary waitress, opens the door to unexpected twists that could change everything. Damien Knight stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, overlooking the city below. The skyline glittered in the distance, a mosaic of light and shadow, but to Damien, it felt like a world far removed from his own. He had everything a person could want: wealth, power, the kind of influence that could make or break entire companies with a single word. Yet, as the lights of the city flickered like stars he couldn't quite touch, he felt a familiar hollowness settle in his chest. The gala was just days away, and the pressure was mounting. His lawyer had been clear: it wasn't just about attending, it was about showing the world he was ready to settle down. Damien's trust fund had been established with strict conditions, one of which was that he must marry and produce heirs before his 35th birthday, or risk losing the fortune that had been both a blessing and a curse. The weight of his family's expectations had always been heavy on his shoulders. He'd been groomed to be the perfect heir: sharp, calculating, never showing weakness. But underneath the polished exterior was a man who had spent his life in the shadow of his own wealth, isolated by the very thing that was supposed to bring him joy. From a young age, Damien had been different. While other children reveled in the luxuries their families could afford, he found solace in books, in quiet moments where he could escape the cold reality of his world. He was the shy boy who preferred the company of his imagination to the noise of society. His tutors praised his intelligence, his ability to grasp complex concepts with ease, but they could never reach the part of him that yearned for something more, something real. His parents, though wealthy and powerful, were distant, treating him more as a future investment than a son. They were people who moved in the highest circles, who valued status above all else. His mother, a woman of impeccable grace and poise, believed that emotion was a weakness. His father, a ruthless businessman, had no time for anything that did not directly contribute to the family empire. So Damien grew up alone, his life dictated by schedules, tutors, and expectations. Even as he matured into a man of striking looks and undeniable charm, he remained guarded, his heart wrapped in layers of defense built over years of neglect. Women admired him from afar, drawn to his wealth and his enigmatic persona, but few dared to get close. Those who tried found a man who was kind yet distant, generous but unreachable. He had built his life around that distance, finding comfort in the quiet corners of his world. But now, with the threat of losing everything he had ever known, he was being pushed out of the shadows and into the spotlight he had always avoided. His lawyer's words echoed in his mind: "You need to show them you're serious, Damien. It's not just about the money, it's about securing your future, your legacy." But what legacy was there for a man who had never truly lived? The idea of marriage, of bringing another person into the lonely world he had constructed, seemed both terrifying and impossible. Yet, the thought of losing his inheritance, of becoming untethered from the one thing that had defined him for so long, was even more frightening. Damien knew he couldn't delay any longer. The gala was a test, a chance to prove he could play the role expected of him. But more than that, it was a reminder of the ticking clock, of the time he had left to fulfill the conditions set by his father's ironclad will. The lawyers had laid it out clearly: marriage and children by 35, or the entire estate would pass to distant relatives who would squander it away. He had never been one to care for parties or the shallow conversations of the elite, but this time, he couldn't avoid it. He needed a date, someone who could help him navigate the evening and the unspoken judgments of those who would be watching. Someone who could make him look like the perfect, settled man his trust demanded he become. But who? The thought of sifting through the list of suitable women his lawyer had provided filled him with a sense of dread. They were all polished, practiced, trained to play the part, exactly the kind of woman he'd spent his life avoiding. What he needed was someone real, someone who could see through the facade and understand the man underneath. The restaurant was nestled on a quiet corner of the city, a hidden gem where the wealthy could dine in peace, away from the prying eyes of the world. Damien had stumbled upon it one evening when the weight of his life felt particularly heavy, and since then, it had become his refuge, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts without the demands of his public persona. One of the reasons that made him feel at ease at this restaurant was the service. Especially Mia. She was not like the others, the waitstaff who smiled too brightly and chatted too freely in hopes of a larger tip. No, Mia was different. She did her job with a kind of practiced efficiency, her interactions with the patrons brief and to the point. She kept her head down, her eyes on her work, never lingering longer than necessary. Damien found himself returning to the restaurant and choosing to be seated in her area of service, drawn not just by the food but by the sense of calm Mia seemed to bring to the place. She never pushed for conversation, never tried to engage him beyond the customary pleasantries. And that suited him just fine. After all, he wasn't there for the company, he was there to escape it. Tonight, that is just what he needed. A little peace and quiet to balance the dilemma of the upcoming gala weighing heavily on his mind. He had to find a solution. Just then, as he sat at his usual table, he happened to look up as Mia was arranging a vase of fresh flowers on a nearby table, her movements fluid, almost elegant in their simplicity. He had never really noticed her before. But now, with his lawyer's words echoing in his ears, he saw Mia in a different light. She was exactly what he needed, someone who could blend into the background, who wouldn't demand anything more from him than what he was willing to give. Someone who could help him navigate the minefield of the gala without raising suspicions. The decision, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. As Mia passed by his table, Damien reached out, his discreet hand movement stopping her in her tracks. She looked down at him, her expression neutral, those dark eyes giving nothing away. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low, measured. He wasn't used to making requests to people he barely knew. But there was no turning back now. Mia raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "What can I do for you, Mr. Knight?" Damien hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I have an event coming up, a charity gala. I need a date, someone who can accompany me and play a role, I suppose you could say." Her eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion clouding her features. "A role?" "Yes," he replied, leaning forward slightly, his gaze intent. "I'm willing to pay you, handsomely. All you would need to do is attend the gala with me, pose as my girlfriend for the evening. Nothing more." Mia's expression remained inscrutable, but Damien could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was weighing his offer, considering the implications, the risks. He respected that about her, she wasn't the type to jump at the first opportunity that came her way. There was a quiet strength in her, a resolve that intrigued him even more. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice steady. "Because you're not like the others," Damien admitted. "You don't ask questions. You don't push. You know how to blend in. And that's exactly what I need." Mia studied him for a long moment, and he could almost see the conflict in her eyes. She was desperate, that much he could tell. Desperate for money, for a way out of whatever circumstances had led her to this point. But she was also wary, cautious in a way that suggested she had learned to be careful with offers that seemed too good to be true. "I'll need to think about it," she said at last, her tone giving nothing away. Damien nodded, respecting her need for time. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But the gala is in 3 days, so I'll need an answer soon. Mia nodded and turned to leave, but Damien stopped her again with a quiet, "Mia." She looked back at him, and for the first time, he saw a hint of vulnerability in her gaze, something unguarded, fleeting. "Whatever your decision," he said softly, "I won't hold it against you." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips before she turned away, leaving Damien to wonder if he had just made the right choice, or the biggest mistake of his life. The ballroom shimmered under the soft glow of chandeliers, a world of elegance and excess that Damien knew all too well. The gala was in full swing, the air buzzing with the hum of polite conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses. Damien stood on the edge of the room, observing the crowd with a practiced eye, his expression carefully composed. He was used to these events, where the wealthy mingled with the powerful, where alliances were forged and broken over cocktails and small talk. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he wasn't alone. Mia stood by his side, her hand lightly resting on his arm, and for a moment, Damien allowed himself to be taken in by the illusion they were creating. She looked stunning, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown that clung to her in all the right places, her dark hair swept up to reveal the delicate curve of her neck. Her eyes, usually so guarded, held a spark of something new, confidence, perhaps, or maybe just the determination to get through the night. From the moment they had arrived, Damien had noticed the way people were drawn to her. There was something about Mia, something that set her apart from the usual parade of socialites and heiresses who frequented these events. She was poised, composed, moving through the room with a quiet grace that belied the nerves he knew she must be feeling. They had rehearsed the details before arriving, how they met, how their relationship had blossomed into something serious. Damien had been meticulous, laying out the story with precision, and Mia had absorbed it all with the focus of someone who knew how much was at stake. But no amount of preparation could have predicted what happened next. It started subtly, as most things did in this world. A raised eyebrow here, a curious glance there. Damien noticed it first when they were introduced to an elderly couple who were old friends of his parents. They were polite, charming in that way only the old money could be, but their interest in Mia was palpable. They asked about her background, her upbringing, and though Mia answered with the vague responses they had agreed upon, Damien could sense her growing unease. As the night wore on, the questions became more pointed, more invasive. A senator's wife, known for her gossiping, cornered Mia near the bar, prying into her past with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Damien watched from a distance as Mia deflected with skill, redirecting the conversation back to safer topics, but he could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers clenched around the stem of her champagne glass. It was during a conversation with a prominent art collector that the slip occurred. They had been discussing a painting on loan from a European museum, a piece that had drawn considerable attention for its history and craftsmanship. The art collector, an older man with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, asked Mia her opinion, likely expecting the usual platitudes from someone he assumed was out of her depth. But Mia surprised them all. She spoke with an authority and insight that immediately captured the room's attention. She discussed the painter's technique, the influence of the political climate at the time, even the subtle symbolism hidden within the brushstrokes. Her words flowed effortlessly, each one a revelation that left the art collector momentarily speechless. The room had grown quiet, conversations tapering off as more and more people turned to listen. Damien watched, transfixed, as Mia captivated the crowd, her voice steady, her knowledge undeniable. It was a side of her he had never seen before, a glimpse into a world he knew nothing about. But as the last word left her lips, he saw it, the flicker of panic in her eyes as she realized what she had done. The room erupted into a murmur of admiration, people moving closer to engage her in conversation, to draw out more of this unexpected expertise. Damien, however, could see the strain behind her smile, the way she began to retreat back into herself, her answers becoming shorter, more clipped. When they finally managed to slip away, Damien didn't hesitate. He led her to a quiet corner of the terrace, away from the prying eyes and probing questions, where the cool night air could offer some relief. But his mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle she had just unwittingly presented. "Mia," he began, his voice low, careful, "how do you know so much about art?" She turned to face him, her expression guarded once more, the confidence she had shown moments ago replaced by something more vulnerable. "I studied it," she replied simply, but Damien could hear the layers beneath her words, the things she wasn't saying. "Studied it where?" he pressed, his curiosity now fully engaged. Mia hesitated, her gaze flickering away, out over the city lights. "It doesn't matter," she said at last, her tone firm, as if that could be the end of it. But it wasn't the end, not for Damien. He could see that now. There was so much more to Mia than he had realized, and the more he learned, the more he wanted to know. But she wasn't ready to share, that much was clear. And for the first time in a long time, Damien found himself uncertain of his next move. But he wasn't going to push, not yet. Instead, he nodded, accepting her silence for what it was. "All right," he said, his voice gentle, "but if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Mia's eyes met his, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a promise. She nodded, and Damien knew the conversation was over, at least for now. But as they rejoined the party, slipping back into their roles, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Damien was curious. Damien couldn't get Mia out of his mind. The way she had spoken at the gala, her knowledge and poise, the flash of vulnerability in her eyes, it all haunted him, stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, yes, but more than that, a need to understand her, to peel back the layers of mystery she kept so carefully guarded. A few days after the gala, he found himself back at the restaurant. It was a place he knew well, but now it felt different, charged with the memories of their last interaction. He arrived earlier than usual, hoping to catch Mia during a quieter moment, when they wouldn't be surrounded by the hum of dinner service and the demands of other patrons. When she finally appeared at his table, her expression was as neutral as ever, her demeanor professional. But Damien saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked, as she approached. "Mr. Knight," she greeted him, the formal tone back in place. "What can I get for you today?" "Mia," he said softly, his voice almost hesitant. "I didn't come for the food." Her gaze shifted slightly, uncertainty playing across her features. "Then what can I do for you?" she asked, the wariness clear in her tone. "I wanted to talk," he replied, watching her carefully. "About the other night. About you." Immediately, he saw the walls go up. Mia's posture stiffened, her expression closing off. "I'm sorry, Mr. Knight," she said, her voice firm, almost clipped. "I have work to do. I can't stop to talk, or I'll get in trouble." Damien could see she was trying to deflect, to shut down the conversation before it even began. But he wasn't ready to let it go. "I understand," he said, keeping his tone gentle, almost coaxing. "But I was hoping we could continue our conversation. I can make it worth your while." Mia hesitated, clearly conflicted. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the need to keep her distance warring with something else, perhaps a hint of curiosity. But she shook her head, as if to clear it. "I appreciate the offer," she said, her voice polite but distant. "But I really can't stop. If there's nothing else, I need to get back to work." Damien watched as she walked away, feeling a pang of frustration. She was slipping through his fingers, the answers he sought slipping away with her. But then an idea formed, and before he could second-guess himself, he called after her. "Mia, wait." She paused, glancing back at him, and he took a breath. "I'll be attending another event soon. I'd like you to come with me." She looked at him, her expression carefully neutral. "Another party?" "Yes," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. "Similar to the gala. You'd be doing the same thing, accompanying me, helping me navigate the evening. And of course, I'll pay you again." Mia studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why?" Damien hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because you did a great job last time," he said, finally settling on a safe answer. "And because I trust you." She considered him for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she gave a small nod. "All right," she agreed. "One more event." Damien nodded, relief mingling with anticipation. "Thank you, Mia. I'll have my driver pick you up." The night of the event arrived, and Damien felt a strange mix of anticipation and nerves. This time, the venue was a more intimate setting, a private dinner hosted by one of the city's leading philanthropists. The crowd would be smaller, the atmosphere more conducive to conversation. It was the perfect opportunity to finally get to the heart of who Mia was. When she arrived, Damien couldn't help but admire how effortlessly she fit into the evening's elegance. She moved through the room with the same quiet grace, her presence understated yet undeniably compelling. But tonight, he noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked around the room, as if she were constantly on guard. As the evening progressed, Damien made sure to stay close, guiding her through the conversations with practiced ease. But his mind was on the moment when they could be alone, when he could finally ask the questions that had been gnawing at him since the gala. Finally, after what felt like hours, they found a moment of quiet on a balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the dinner, and for a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, looking out at the lights below. "Mia," Damien began softly, breaking the silence. "There's something I need to ask you." She turned to face him, her expression guarded, as if she already knew what was coming. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, then plunged ahead. "The other night, at the gala, you spoke about art in a way that surprised me. It was clear you knew more than you let on." Mia's eyes darkened, a flash of something, fear, perhaps, flickering across her features. "Damien, I told you, it was just an act." "I don't believe that," he said quietly, holding her gaze. "What I saw wasn't an act. It was real. And I think there's more to you than you're letting on." For a long moment, Mia was silent, her eyes searching his, as if weighing the risk of what she was about to reveal. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. My real name is Amira." Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if saying it out loud brought back memories she'd tried to bury. "I'm the daughter of diplomats. Well, I was. My parents were respected, influential in their country, always advocating for peace, for democracy." Her voice faltered for a moment, and Damien waited, sensing she was fighting with memories she hadn't revisited in years. Then, she continued, her tone more measured, like someone trying to lay out the facts of a story that still cut deep. "We lived in a beautiful city, full of history and culture, where my parents hosted dinners with foreign dignitaries, attended conferences on human rights, and pushed for reforms that would give people more freedom, more power. They believed in what they were doing, even when the risks began to rise." She paused, and Damien could see the memories playing out behind her eyes, memories of a childhood shaped by ideals and responsibilities that few others could comprehend. "My father was a principled man," Amira continued, her voice tinged with pride and sorrow. He believed in diplomacy, in the power of words and treaties to change the world. My mother was the same, strong, compassionate, always working alongside him to bring about the change they believed was possible. They were a team, and they loved their work. Damien listened, captivated by the picture she painted of a life so different from the one she led now. A life filled with purpose, with the kind of idealism that had clearly shaped the woman standing before him. But then, Amira said, her voice dropping as if she were afraid of what came next, things began to change. The political climate shifted. The people in power were replaced by those who cared more about control than progress. They started cracking down on dissent, arresting activists, silencing anyone who spoke out. She looked out over the city, her expression distant, as if she were seeing the past rather than the present. My parents tried to push back, to keep fighting for what they believed in. But it became clear that it was no longer safe. The new regime saw them as a threat. Damien could sense the tension in her words, the way the story was tightening around her, constricting like a vine. He didn't say anything, didn't push, just let her take the time she needed to continue. One night, Amira said, her voice barely above a whisper now, my father came into my room. I'll never forget the look on his face. He was always so calm, so composed, but that night, he was different. There was fear in his eyes, and I knew something was terribly wrong. Damien felt a chill run through him, imagining the scene she was describing. He could picture the fear in her father's eyes, the dread of knowing what was to come. He told me I had to leave, Amira continued, her voice shaking now. That he had arranged for me to stay with a trusted friend in another country. He said it was just for a little while, just until things settled down. He promised me everything would be okay. She paused, her breath hitching slightly as she fought back the tears threatening to fall. Damien wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew she needed to finish the story in her own way. So, the next morning, Amira said, her voice steadying, I packed a small bag, and my father drove me to the airport. He told me to be brave, that I had to trust him. And I did. I trusted him completely. She stopped, the weight of those words hanging in the air between them. Damien didn't press her to continue, knowing that the rest of the story was still too raw, too painful to speak aloud. Thank you for telling me, he said quietly, his voice full of the sincerity he felt. I can't imagine what you've been through. Amira looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. The city below was alive with lights and motion, but on the balcony where Damien and Amira stood, the world seemed to have slowed to a stillness that neither of them wanted to break. The silence after Amira's confession was heavy, charged with the weight of everything left unsaid. Damien didn't press her, he could see that she was gathering herself, drawing in a breath before she could continue the story that had clearly haunted her for so long. When my father put me on that plane, Amira finally began, her voice quieter now, more fragile, I truly believed it was just for a little while. I had faith that everything would return to normal, that my parents would find a way to make things right. I was scared, of course, but I trusted them. I trusted him. She paused, and Damien could almost see the images flashing through her mind, the last moments with her father, the fear she had tried so hard to hide. The friend he sent me to, she continued, was someone I'd known all my life. He was like an uncle to me, someone I thought I could rely on. He took me in, helped me get settled in a new country, a new life. But the waiting, the not knowing, it was unbearable. Damien felt a tightness in his chest as he listened, imagining what it must have been like for her, a young girl, alone in a foreign place, waiting for news that never came. At first, he was kind, Amira said, her voice tinged with a sadness that went beyond words. He reassured me that my parents would be okay, that they were just being careful, that they'd contact me as soon as it was safe. But as the weeks turned into months, and then a year, everything changed. She looked out into the night, her eyes distant, lost in the memories she was reliving. He started to pull away, she continued, her voice steady, though Damien could hear the hurt buried beneath it. He stopped giving me updates, stopped answering my questions. I'd catch him looking at me with this look of pity. It was like he knew something he wasn't telling me. And then, one day, he just left. Left? Damien repeated, his voice low with disbelief. Amira nodded, her expression one of resignation. Yes. He said he had to go back to our country, that there was something important he needed to take care of. He promised he'd be back, but he never returned. I was alone. He left me in this small apartment with just enough money to last a few months. No instructions, no way to contact him. Nothing. Damien's hands tightened into fists at his sides. The idea of someone abandoning her like that, leaving her to fend for herself, made his blood run cold with anger. How could he do that to you? He asked, his voice tight with the effort to keep his emotions in check. Amira gave a small, bitter laugh. He probably thought he was doing me a favor, leaving me to figure things out on my own. Maybe he believed it was better than telling me the truth. Or maybe he was just scared, too. She shook her head, as if to dismiss the speculation. But whatever his reasons, I was on my own. And I had no choice but to survive. She paused, gathering herself, her voice growing steadier as she continued. With no support and no real resources, I had to take whatever work I could find. It wasn't easy, no one wanted to hire a young woman with no experience, no family, no references. But I managed. Odd jobs, cleaning, waitressing, anything that would put food on the table. Damien listened, his heart aching with every word she spoke. The thought of her struggling like that, of her having to fight so hard just to get by, made him feel a deep sense of injustice. You were all alone, he said softly, more a statement than a question. Yes, Amira replied, her voice flat. I was. But I couldn't afford to dwell on it. I had to keep a low profile, to avoid drawing attention to myself. I knew that if the new government found out where I was, they could come after me. Or worse, use me as leverage against my parents. So I stayed under the radar, did what I had to do, and tried to stay invisible. The strength in her words, the quiet, unyielding resolve, struck Damien deeply. She had survived, against all odds, in a world that had taken everything from her. But even now, he could see the toll it had taken, the way her eyes reflected a pain that no one should have to bear alone. What about your parents? Damien asked gently, almost afraid of the answer. Did you ever hear from them again? Amira looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if to keep them from trembling. No, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The new government announced that they had been executed as traitors. But I never saw any proof, never got any confirmation. Just an announcement, a headline in a foreign newspaper, and then, nothing. Damien felt a wave of sorrow wash over him. So you don't know if they're really gone, he said softly. Amira shook her head, her eyes filling with unshed tears. No, I don't. And that's what haunts me. The not knowing. The uncertainty. I've had to live with that every single day, wondering if they're still alive somewhere, if they're suffering, if they're thinking of me. The raw pain in her voice was almost too much to bear, and Damien took a step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. Amira, he said, his voice full of the sincerity he felt, I can't imagine what you've been through, but I want you to know, you're not alone anymore. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of pity or judgment. But all she found was understanding. The city's lights stretched out beneath them, a glittering sea that seemed so far removed from the darkness of Amira's story. Damien stood beside her on the balcony, the weight of her words heavy on his heart. He had known loss, but not like this. Not the kind that left you drifting in a world where every step forward was haunted by the ghosts of what could have been. He found himself admiring her in a way that was deeper than he had expected. It wasn't just her strength, though that was undeniable. It was the quiet resilience, the way she had endured so much without letting it break her completely. She had survived, even when everything had been taken from her, and now she stood before him, still fighting, still holding on. "I can't imagine what you've been through," Damien said softly, his voice carrying a note of regret that he couldn't erase her pain. "But I want you to know, I'm here. Whatever you need, whatever I can do to help, you don't have to go through this alone anymore." Amira looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flicker of hope that had been so carefully buried under years of fear and uncertainty. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if she were testing the truth of his words, measuring the sincerity behind them. Then, she gave a small nod, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Damien. That means more to me than you know." They stood in silence for a while, the night air cool against their skin, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Damien could feel the shift between them, the connection that had been forged through shared pain and the promise of understanding. It was something he hadn't felt in a long time, maybe ever. A bond that wasn't built on the superficialities of his world, but on something real, something deep. Finally, Damien spoke again, his voice more tentative now. "You know, I know a little about being alone too. My life, it's been different from yours, and everyone always assumes it was paradise." She turned to look at him, curiosity in her eyes. "Tell me." He took a deep breath, surprised by how much he wanted to open up to her, to let her see the parts of him that he usually kept hidden. "I grew up in a world where love was a transaction, where every move was calculated, every decision made with an eye on the bottom line. My parents were cold, distant, more interested in the family's reputation than in raising a child. Everything was about control, about maintaining the image we were supposed to project to the world." Amira listened, her expression softening as she heard the pain beneath his words. "That must have been lonely," she said gently. "It was," Damien admitted, a touch of bitterness in his voice. "I learned early on that the only person I could rely on was myself. So I built walls. I pushed people away. It was easier that way, safer to not have any expectations about anybody else." He paused, his gaze drifting out over the city. "I've had everything I could ever want, but none of it ever felt real. Of course I do not want to compare our past, but I just wanted to let you know that I understand what it is to be alone." Amira reached out, her hand gently resting on his arm, a gesture of understanding that spoke louder than words. "You're not alone, Damien," she said softly. "You don't have to be." Her touch, her words, they stirred something in him, something that had been dormant for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in that moment, he knew that whatever walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crack. "I don't want to be alone anymore," Damien confessed, the admission surprising even himself. "And I don't want you to be, either." Amira's eyes met his, and in that shared gaze, something shifted between them, a mutual understanding, a recognition of the loneliness they had both endured, and the possibility of something more. It was a connection that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together, something deeper, more profound. But even as Damien felt the bond between them strengthen, a question lingered in the back of his mind, a question that had been growing ever since she had shared her story. What if her parents were still alive? What if everything she had been forced to believe, everything she had suffered, had been based on a lie? I've been thinking, Damien said slowly, carefully choosing his words. About your parents. About what really happened to them. Amira's expression tightened slightly, the hope in her eyes dimming as the harsh reality of her situation returned. Damien, I've already told you, there's nothing more to find. The government announced their deaths. There's no reason to believe they're still alive. But what if they are? Damien pressed, his voice filled with a determination he hadn't expected. What if the government lied? It wouldn't be the first time a regime has tried to cover up the truth. What if your parents are out there, somewhere, and they need help? Amira looked away, the weight of his words pressing down on her. I've thought about it, she admitted quietly. Every day, I've wondered if maybe, somehow, they survived. But I've never been able to find any proof. And without proof, I don't know if I can let myself hope. Damien's mind was already racing, the possibilities spinning out before him. I can help you, he said, the resolve in his voice clear. I have resources, connections, people who could dig deeper, who might find something that was missed. We could try to find out the truth, Amira. Together. She hesitated, the fear of false hope warring with the desire to know, to finally have answers. Damien, this could be dangerous. If the regime is still looking for me. I'll protect you, Damien interrupted, his voice firm. We'll be careful. But you deserve to know what really happened. And if there's even the slightest chance that your parents are still out there, we have to find them. Amira's eyes searched his, the intensity of his resolve breaking through her hesitation. Slowly, she nodded, the decision made. All right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll try. Damien felt a surge of relief, of determination. But he also knew the risks, the delicate situation they were about to step into. There's one more thing we need to consider, he added, his tone more serious now. Your visa papers, they might not be completely in order. If we start digging, it could draw attention that could put you at risk. Amira's expression tightened with the realization of what that could mean. What do we do? Damien was silent for a moment, his mind already working on a solution. The idea came to Damien in the quiet hours of the night, when the city was asleep and the weight of the day's events settled heavily on his shoulders. He had been lying awake, thinking of Amira and the risks they were about to take. He knew that the search for her parents could bring danger, that it might draw attention from the very people they were trying to avoid. And that's when it hit him, the one solution that could protect her, give them both the freedom to search for the truth without the looming threat of her uncertain status. It was a wild idea, the kind that most people would dismiss without a second thought. But the more Damien considered it, the more it made sense. It was the only way to keep her safe, to ensure that she had the protection and stability she needed as they embarked on this journey. But convincing her, that would be the challenge. The next morning, Damien invited Amira to his penthouse, a decision that spoke to the growing trust between them. When she arrived, she seemed more at ease than before, the connection they had forged over the last few days softening the usual tension in her posture. But when Damien led her to the balcony, the same spot where they had shared so much, she could tell something was weighing on his mind. What's going on, Damien? She asked, her voice laced with curiosity and a touch of concern. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before turning to face her. I've been thinking a lot about what we're about to do, about the risks, the uncertainty. And I've come up with a way to protect you, to make sure we can do this without putting you in danger. Amira frowned slightly, sensing the gravity of his words. What are you suggesting? Damien hesitated for just a moment, then spoke the words that had been circling in his mind all night. We should get married. The shock on Amira's face was immediate. She blinked, as if she hadn't heard him correctly, her eyes widening in disbelief. Married? Damien, that's crazy. I know it sounds crazy, Damien quickly added, his voice calm but insistent. But hear me out. If we get married, you'll become a citizen. You'll have legal protection, and we'll be able to travel together without worrying about your visa status or drawing attention. It's the only way I can think of to keep you safe while we search for your parents. Amira stared at him, the enormity of what he was proposing washing over her. She took a step back, shaking her head slowly as she tried to process the idea. It's too much, Damien. Marriage isn't something you just do for convenience. I know, Damien said softly, taking a step toward her, his gaze steady on hers. And I want you to know, this would be a facade. A marriage on paper, nothing more. I would never take advantage of you, Amira. This is about protecting you, about giving us both the freedom to find the truth without the risks that come with your current situation. Amira looked at him, searching his eyes for any hint of doubt, of ulterior motive. But all she saw was sincerity, the same unwavering resolve that had drawn her to him in the first place. He was offering her a way forward, a chance to finally take control of her own fate, and he was doing it with nothing but the purest of intentions. Slowly, she looked up at him, her heart pounding as she grappled with the decision. On one hand, the thought of marrying Damien, of entering into something so serious, so binding, made her feel like she was stepping into a world she wasn't prepared for. But on the other hand, she knew that he was right, there was no other way. If she wanted to find out what happened to her parents, if she wanted any hope of closure, this was the path she would have to take. Okay, she said quietly, the word barely above a whisper. I'll do it. Damien's expression softened with relief, and he reached out to take her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. We'll figure this out together, Amira. I promise you, I'll do everything I can to help you find the truth. The wedding itself was a quiet affair, held in the privacy of Damien's penthouse with only a few close friends as witnesses. There was no grand celebration, no elaborate vows, just the two of them, standing side by side as they made a commitment that was as much about trust and protection as it was about anything else. But as they exchanged rings, Damien couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a formality. There was a depth to the moment that he hadn't anticipated, a sense of connection that went beyond the practical reasons for their union. When the ceremony was over and the guests had left, Damien and Amira sat together in the quiet of the penthouse, the reality of what they had just done settling over them. It was strange, this new dynamic between them, strange, but not unwelcome. They both knew that their journey was just beginning, that the marriage was only the first step in a much larger plan. Soon after, they began their search in earnest, traveling to the places where her parents had once been active, following the faintest of leads in the hope of uncovering the truth. It was a difficult journey, filled with dead ends and frustrations, but Damien never wavered in his support. He was there for her, every step of the way, his presence a constant source of strength. And then, finally, they found them. It happened in a small town, far from the chaos of the city. Damien and Amira had been following a lead that seemed as unlikely as all the others, but this time, it paid off. They found her parents, alive but weary, hiding from the government that had branded them as traitors. The reunion was bittersweet, there was joy, of course, but also the painful reminder of all the years that had been lost. Damien watched as Amira embraced her parents, tears streaming down her face, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had helped her reach this moment. But there was also something else, something more personal. Seeing her with her family, seeing the love and relief in her eyes, made him realize just how much she had come to mean to him. It wasn't just about protection anymore, or even about the quest for truth. It was about her, about the woman she was, the strength she had shown, and the way she had opened up a part of him he hadn't known existed. When they returned to the city, with her parents, it was with a sense of completion, as if the chapter they had started together was finally coming to a close. But for Amira, there was still one more realization to come. It hit her in the quiet moments, when the excitement of the reunion had faded and she was left alone with her thoughts. She realized that somewhere along the way, she had fallen in love with Damien. It was a love that had grown slowly, steadily, until it had become as much a part of her as the air she breathed. And now, she knew she couldn't imagine her life without him. She found Damien on the balcony, looking out over the city, as he so often did. When he turned to face her, she saw the same love reflected in his eyes, the same unspoken connection that had been building between them for so long. They stood together in silence, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, emotions that had been building, layer by layer, since the day they met. Amira looked at Damien, her heart pounding in her chest, and knew she couldn't keep it inside any longer. "I never expected this," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of her confession. "I never expected to feel this way about you. I thought it was just a facade, something we had to do. But it's not, Damien." For a moment, Damien said nothing, and Amira's heart sank, fear tightening her throat. What if she had misread everything? What if she had opened herself up, only to find that he didn't feel the same way? But then Damien's hand reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. His touch was warm, reassuring, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with the same vulnerability she had just shown. "I've been scared to admit it," Damien confessed, his voice low, thick with emotion. "I didn't want to believe that this could be real. But, Amira, it is. It's real, and I'm in love with you." Relief washed over Amira, so intense that it nearly brought her to tears. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands, her eyes searching his. "You don't know how much I wanted to hear that," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I love you, Damien. I love you so much." Damien pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. "I love you too," he whispered into her hair, his voice full of the promise they were both finally ready to make. "I've loved you for so long, and I'm so relieved to know you feel the same." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the city below them a world away. In that moment, all the uncertainty, all the fear and doubt, melted away, leaving only the love they had finally admitted to each other. A love that would carry them through whatever came next, together. As they held each other, Amira knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace, knowing that she had finally found her place in the world, with Damien, the man who had become her everything,